Oop, there we go. And then up. Yeah, there we go. Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Cactus Chu, who will introduce himself. He is a very smart guy. He's running a podcast called Metapolitics, in that he explores various ways in which politics are being shaped by and shaping discourse. And that's kind of what we cover in this conversation. We talk a lot about narrative warfare and the media environment that we are all existing within, and certain trends that are kind of pushing us towards, I guess, some sort of nihilistic endpoint of internecine conflict. A lot of big words from my mouth right now. Do check out his podcast. It's linked down in the description, as is his Twitter and his Clubhouse handle. He's very active on Clubhouse. He's a very great interlocutor, and I think I pronounced that correctly. He's somebody pretty awesome to speak with and to hear speak. So without further ado, here is Cactus Chu. How do I introduce you? Like, what's your basic function in the world? Are you a social scientist, economist, chef?
I don't know, because I've given this tagline now to multiple people. Like, this is just a thing that I heard from a fellow podcaster of, like, you should always have an intro line to give to people. But I realized, especially, like, I realized after going on Clubhouse that people, like, recognize that this is the game that's being played and recognize that I just give the same intro line. So I'm not sure if I should keep doing that. But the intro line is Cactus Chu, mathematician, political commentator, and host of Metapolitics Podcast. And I think we can still use it for at least a few more times.
How's Clubhouse treating you? When did you start on that? You're very active.
I don't know at this point. Joined February 25th, 2021.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually wanted to stay out of it for quite a while before. Basically, the only reason I joined it initially was just that people told me that it was an unparalleled place to podcast market. And I mean, they ended up being right. But also, I feel like, I don't know, I'm not the type of person who likes social media, and it does give me those types of vibes. But, well, it's a necessary evil, I guess. Plus, I think I'm able to help a lot of other people, so.
You do have the capacity to shape discourse. Repeatedly, I've seen you pivot conversation.
Yeah, I feel like with a lot of the problem is that you're trying to get to the end of a road, right? In terms of developing political ideas, the problem is that everyone in the same room with you is at various points along that road, right? So someone just jumping in might be very interested in the kind of what is the mentality of woke, for example, in those types of rooms? What is the kind of sources of indoctrination or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. The very intro cynical theories type of stuff. While someone much later on might be interested in the what do you do about it, in the structural approaches, institutions, etc., and just navigating some sort of track that allows everyone to move down that path is the great struggle. But hey, it's better than nothing.
You sound like an unwitting educator.
I don't know. Like, I've taught before, nothing close to this. I used to teach computer science, actually, and the nice thing about, especially about teaching at a private organization, which is what I did, is that you can select the students. And especially with, thankfully, the control that I was given over my classes, I could basically reorganize between classes as much as I wished. And that's just an amazing capability, or amazing privilege, I guess. I feel really bad for all of the public school teachers who are given kind of a slate of students who clearly are not at the same ability level and are just asked to especially with the way that it's done, just here's the curriculum, here's a set of students who are obviously not performing the same, and you are to give the curriculum to the class as it is written and do the best you can with regards to that. And it's like, before you even enter the classroom, it's already a losing battle, unfortunately. But yeah, I think actually that mindset has a lot to contribute to how to organize a room effectively in Clubhouse.
In what way do you think?
I mean the public school teacher mindset, like being able to push through and navigate those types of unwinnable situations can often be an analog, especially in some big rooms.
Yeah.
The difference is that in Clubhouse it's self-selected, right, which actually gives you a lot of room.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a road that everybody's on, or at different parts on. Where are you on this road? Are you at the cliff, kind of waving people over to your place?
Yeah, we're all falling off the cliff together. Now, it's actually quite strange for me because I'm not someone who really cared too much about the culture war type of thing beforehand, especially before Clubhouse. I mean, it intensified to the point where I had to care about it, even on the podcast on Metapolitics. But really, I started off with the sort of approach at looking at media. What are the dynamics of these various systems? How could it lead to corruption? How does it lead to corruption? And actually, it was very non-US centric at the beginning because the niche was really people who were looking for a broader understanding of democracy and of media across the world, right? So we would cover things like Lebanon. We would cover things like the whole Putin saga and Alexei Navalny. And those would be the moments where you would see, here's the fine line between democratic progress or truth-seeking and the manipulations against it. And you would kind of try to broaden out that approach, look at the principles of what can you learn, what can you take away from that. And unfortunately, these phenomena just kept getting closer and closer to home, the kind of balancing act between a successful media system and an unsuccessful media system in terms of actually getting to something that's representative of the real world, until, quite frankly, the majority of these cases now, the majority of situations where media is being manipulated and there's some core principle that we can take out of it, most of that comes from the United States, and it comes from the culture wars. So it's actually a really backwards priority, I think, where most people start learning about the culture wars, and then they start learning about the things behind it, the forces that actually lead to those events. I call that like the Haidt pill, after John Haidt. You start thinking that this is a question of politics, and then you take the Haidt pill and you realize that it's a question of psychology. Yeah. And I think I took the Haidt pill before even looking at the culture war, before looking at American politics in specific. And so I'm well down the institutional lane. I'm well down at looking at what are the actual incentives and economic forces that lead us to this point. And honestly, not that tired of the culture war, not that even exposed to the culture war itself.
Not that tired in what way? In that
there are a lot of people who approach these types of culture war issues and they just hear it and they're like, oh, not again. And I'm not like that, I think, just because I haven't really experienced it that much. I'm not someone who typically tunes into those types of arguments, and I usually just ignore the more culture-based policies or culture-based news stories or arguments in my typical daily life, and really only came to it in recent months because it was being so intertwined with media manipulation.
Yeah.
And so I don't think I have that like instinctive exhaustion that many people who cover these areas do.
Yeah, yeah. Andrew Yang just tweeted out today about some transcript of a New York Times meeting where it looks to be the case that they decided to inject race into every story. And I bring that up because media is, well, as a question, do you think media is fueling the culture war, and why is media fueling this culture war?
Yeah, I absolutely think that it's not only is the culture war downstream of media, but it's the entire system of politics. If you actually just look at lines between various metrics of media polarization, things like the emotional characteristic of headlines versus the partisan polarization in things like the Senate and things like voting records, then you can see a pretty direct correlation, if not a causation. And so you see that this media has a significant impact on the actual way that people treat specific news stories, regardless of the news stories themselves. You can think of the quote-unquote Obamacare versus Affordable Care Act debate, where literally the name of the policy, even though they refer to the exact same thing, will drastically change public favorability ratings by something like 20%, right? So you end up with the situation where, I don't want to ever seem like I'm looking down on people who are parsing things through this media apparatus, because quite frankly, they're not stupid. They just don't have a lot of time on their hands. If you're focused on your job, if you're focused on other things, then you don't have time to look through all of the political context, to look through what are the incentives behind the media station that I'm looking at. You probably just flick to one or the other and settle down and try to get your brief summary of the day. I think the difference that has actually happened is that various politically interested parties, not necessarily just the parties themselves, but various factions, various activist groups, etc., has realized that control of the media has much more of an effect than anything else that they could do. And so that's become the focal point of the game. And you get the polarization that you expect from that.
Yeah. Do you think that media competency, so-called, is the path forward? And if so, what are the basic principles that you think that the average news ingester should be aware of or practice?
I mean, the problem is that you have an arms race, and you have an arms race between people who don't really care enough to fight in the arms race and are just trying to keep themselves afloat, and people whose very livelihoods are built up on creating better and better tools and becoming emotionally manipulative and becoming manipulative in a way that works regardless of someone's inherent political leanings. So all of these people who are working in lobby groups, who are working in political parties, who are representatives themselves, all of them have an interest that is tied to their very well-being, right? Whereas the people who are actually casting those votes, this actually affects them very marginally. Each individual vote, each individual piece of media doesn't change their lives nearly as much as, for example, a pay raise or another hour put into their work. However, this accumulation of power by these representatives, by these interested groups, stacks up over time such that you get this duopoly that's put into place, this iron-tight control over various spheres of media that create a really toxic environment for anyone who's trying to provide an alternate source of information, anyone who's trying to push back against some type of hegemony, whether it's on the left or on the right. And so even if people aren't necessarily aware of this, even if this isn't something that people are immediately looking to as the cause of many of their problems, I think it's something that builds up over time and can accumulate into something that's very damaging to them.
And then add social media and watch acceleration happen.
Yeah, I mean, social media is just a question of doing the same silly and manipulative things much better than was done traditionally. The actual motives and incentives involved, if you look at, for example, the social dilemma lines, all of those lines describe mass media equally as effectively as they describe social media, at least with regards to the intention piece of it. The quote-unquote people are worth more as dead slabs of attention, just like whales are worth more as oil than they are alive, right? All of those things can be true just as much about CNN as it is about Facebook. But the question is, some people don't like it when that's taken to the extreme, for good reason. The extreme is incredibly damaging. But that doesn't really change the underlying incentives in all of these different platforms and different sources at the very beginning, right?
Which is, what are those
Which is
incentives?
To take the attention, right? You had in the Nixon era is follow the money. Now in 2020, it's follow the attention. Whatever news story can enrapture many people, can keep people watching regardless of whether it's something that's actually beneficial to them, regardless of whether it's something that's actually valuable to them. And this means things that enrage people, things that activate that sort of limbic system. Those things are going to be the most valuable. And if you follow the attention, then you end up following the money. And that's exactly what you see with mass media, exactly what you see with social media.
Yeah, a lowest common denominator of attention would be somewhere in the reptilian brain where we can just get triggered.
And you see this playing out in everything from the sampling that happens. Well, what news stories are important? Certainly not the ones that are actually killing the most Americans, but instead the ones that we can attribute to some motive without actually doing the due diligence required to do so, right? Mm-hmm. Every single, or I don't want to use too broad of a brush because I'm sure there are some good journalists out there, right? You can probably name some examples off the top of your head. But with regards to what ends up winning economically, what ends up being most successful, what ends up becoming hegemonic, it does tend to be those things that are very good at hijacking your attention.
You said that there is this duopoly leads to a toxic environment for those who are seeking to provide alternative source of information. What do you mean by that? What creates a toxicness for the independent journalist or content creator?
Yeah, so once you have something that is foundationally irresponsible to reality, right? Once you have something whose business model is based on attracting attention instead of providing a valuable product in terms of a product that reflects what is actually happening out there in the world, if that gets called out, that is still a non-zero factor in terms of their ability to generate revenue, right? You don't get the same experience from watching outrage news if you know in your head, in the back of your mind, that this is intended to outrage you. This is intended to be emotionally captivating and not necessarily to give me a good product. So how do you avoid that while still reaping the benefit of having that outrage news mechanic? Well, it's easy. You silence any dissenters. And so there's an active interest for many of these groups to target those that would actually bring this idea to the forefront, which would actually bring to the forefront the mechanisms that are happening. And you've seen this happen to various core figures, not to specifically endorse any given one of them, but for example, Glenn Greenwald, for example, Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss. This has happened almost always in direct response to their actions in calling out one type of hegemony or the other. Mm-hmm. In the case of Greenwald, it's actually happened several times to him repeatedly, whether it's by Americans, by Bolsonaro, or any other source.
Well, maybe he's just a glutton for punishment.
I don't know. Maybe Glenn actually just is a fan of it all, but who knows?
Yeah. So if within the Substack, the OnlyFans of content creation, YouTube, right, there is the possibility for smaller independent operators to directly link up with a fan base and provide enough support for them to continue to do real work or quality work in the journalistic space. Are you cynical about that? Do you think that that's a path forward, or do you think it's doomed to failure?
I mean, it depends what you mean by success and failure, right? You've probably heard of the 1,000 True Fans model by now.
Could you say that to the general audience?
Sure. So the 1,000 True Fans model is essentially that if you have 1,000 true fans, each of them gives you $50 a year, for example, right? Around $4 a month. Then that's actually a fairly sustainable livelihood, right? Depending on your costs. And so you don't actually need that many audience members to create a sustainable living for yourself. Mm-hmm. However, that's the ultimate question of success, right? Is success just being able to live a fairly decent middle-class life as a content creator? I mean, for many people it is, especially if you're non-political. If you're someone who is interested in changing the ultimate dialogue, though, this kind of long tail of YouTube or long tail of podcasting isn't going to do it, unfortunately. And of course, there are broader networks that you can connect to, people that in specific that you can influence. But actually just staying in the sort of narrow lane without actually accumulating, without actually getting growth, without actually interacting with many of the bigger players in media, I don't think is going to change the broader political landscape, unfortunately.
Do you think that this might sound like a stupid question, but do you think that there's a need or an urgent need to change that grand circus up there? Won't it always just be, just a bunch of flashing lights, a big carnival of spectacle? And will it not just always be like that? And something a couple feet below that rowdy surface is where the actual thinking is going on, and then the actual long-term thinking and policy making.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at various points in time and say that many of these cases are a political circus, but there are differences in the circuses, right? There are differences between a circus that's actively malicious towards the vast majority of Americans, actively malicious to many kind of common sense or many evidently true science-backed opinions versus, or even not just opinions, but of basic facts, versus a clown car that is a bit distracting, is a bit performative and over-dramatic, but ultimately reflects some debate that impacts people in real life, right? There's a real quantitative difference to that, even if the veneer of showmanship is still the same. And I think focusing on making that marginal impact is the best people who are concerned about media quality can ultimately do.
What qualifies as a marginal change, then? Just waking up individuals to being aware of what they're looking at?
Yeah, the thing that I've also often said is that if you change 10 people's minds, you change 10 people's minds, right? That's not a small thing to do, especially if that's something that's actively being done by a large share of Americans, right? Or a large share of people worldwide who are undergoing these media circumstances, right? Especially if you leverage what I call network effects, right? If you leverage the growth that scales based on the number of people involved, whether you're a political movement, whether you're a media outlet, etc. If you get each of the people that you convince to kind of walk away from this narrative warfare, if you convince each of those people not only to do that, but to repeat the same process for themselves, then this hits the realm of exponential growth, and it becomes broadly impactful relatively quickly with only a few iterations. So actually understanding those kind of fundamental mathematical dynamics with regards to how information is shared, how opinions change, is something that can be incredibly beneficial to act incrementally but end up with a significant result.
Do you think that there could be a guiding narrative or a guiding set of values that would help somebody who wants to make marginal change with regards to the circus and reality? Like what would guide them and then scale up to other people wanting to play along, and then figuring out that these rules, playing this game, is actually more rewarding in a variety of ways?
Yeah, well, we're talking about meaning seeking here, right?
Yes. Meaning.
Yeah, we're talking about finding a story that we can tell ourselves that gives us some motivation to do this. Because, quite frankly, saying that politics is self-destructive and you're being essentially taxed for your time and is quite often taxed for your actual money with regards to these political interests, that's a short-term motivation. That's like something that can get you angry in and of itself, but it's not something that builds a sustainable movement. And I think that that's something that we are looking towards. And quite frankly, I don't have one singular answer, right? People tend to vary, individuals differ, and we need to adapt this type of narrative for as many people. But from what I've seen, and I think your people in your audience will mostly be able to identify with one of these three groups, you end up with as I said, three types of narratives in terms of combating this. One is the free speech absolutist crowd, the principled liberals who really see the value of the current societal rules, right? Of things like free and open debate, freedom of association, and avoiding persecution. And they're often people who have studied history. They're often people who have a very moral understanding of what's at stake. And that is one possible inroad. The others are, the second I think I've seen is this kind of standard right-wing bull in a china shop approach, where they very clearly identify the problem and they're just willing to do almost whatever it takes. They're willing to put the kitchen sink at the problem. And you can kind of encapsulate this with the Donald Trump approach, right? And obviously most people are not as extreme as Trump. Most people are not.
Donald Trump would be the sink that's being thrown at
yes.
the problem. Okay, just to make that clear.
Yeah, and people aren't necessarily using that as sort of the policy basis, but the core meaning there is of pure rejection, of pure pushback.
Yeah,
and
a reactionary kind of thing. Yeah.
And the third I've seen is the compassionate or empathetic route, where people tend to understand suffering that many of these people are going through, people in the quote unquote woke movement or people in other extremist movements, even extremist movements on the right, and seek to kind of be these people's therapist of helping them along, helping them find some other source of meaning in their life, de-radicalizing them, etc. And their guiding motive is the human aspect, the ability to form a connection, the ability for redemption, and once again, these core moral values. The difficulty comes in actually tying all of these groups together and tying all of these groups in a way that surmounts an institutional challenge. Because the most common problem that I found with actually all three of these groups is that their seeking of meaning or their foundational appeal to what they perceive as their enemy, they perceive their enemy as the individuals, right? The play-by-play cultists that they encounter either on social media, in real life, etc. The people who are repeating these extremist ideologies, and they really want to either help or defeat the individual. And this comes from the fact that actually all three of these groups are heavily individually minded. But if you actually look at the source of the problem, this really rapidly, at the very least, creates an inefficiency, because you're unfortunately not dealing with just a cult. You're dealing with a cult factory, a system of institutions, of political interests, of media that can infinitely generate more of these people and can kind of undo any progress you make on the individual level really quickly. Actually, you know this very well probably because of the whole incident with Evergreen. And something that Brett Weinstein has said is that he's managed to get through to these people on many occasions. The problem is that they go back to their circles, and there's a you can call it self-correcting mechanism that reinforces people into rejoining these types of ideologies. That is what I call the cult factory. And looking at those dynamics, looking at those incentives of why really this small ideological minority, and here I mean minority as in they believe something that almost no one believes, is able to punch above their weight so much in terms of really creating a culture, creating an activist lens that becomes dominant in these institutions, is that they understand those levers of power. And those levers of power, in turn, cycle back into creating these cultists that we all encounter now. But simply kind of punching at the problem is like punching a waterfall, right? It's not very effective. And these attempts to treat individual cultists or individual extremists, etc., is going to end up being, at the very least, very time-consuming for a very low reward, and in the more cynical view, which happens to be my view, actually distracting people from the active problem and the active solutions that can be pursued.
That, on the surface or on the face of it, contradicts what you were saying about if you can change 10 people's minds and then get them to change 10 more people's minds. That you said that was a viable path towards changing the course.
Yeah, that is a viable path. It's just that you actually have to succeed in changing those people's minds, right?
Okay.
And more often than not, those people whose minds are actually willing to be changed are not just more often than not, but the vast majority, and actually almost every single one of the people whose minds are actually permanently changed, who don't revert to these kind of cult-like incentives, are those who aren't involved in the movement in the first place. It's the spectators, it's the people sitting on the sidelines who you can then convince and you can then help build up into recognizing this problem as it is, right?
Okay.
So those are two different paths to pursue, and I don't really think they're in contradiction.
Okay. So with regards to the cult factory, which is another hot topic, at least we talk about media, we talk about the academy, and we probably talk about, to one degree or another, there's this corporate influence that's going on. Do you see those as three distinct things? Are there more? And then how can we, kind of look at those all together and then separate into how do we deal with each one of those parts of the system?
Yeah, there are other people who are much better at dealing with one specific point, one specific element of the various institutions. For example, Peter Boghossian seems to have a very concrete plan for dealing with universities or higher education. But the way to look at this as an abstraction is to look at it as an incentive game. Their core strength comes obviously not in numbers, because their ideology is held by very few in actuality, but instead on changing the incentives on what happens if you agree with them and what happens if you don't. Mm-hmm. Someone who disagrees with them gets incredibly outsized punishment or incredibly outside vengeance, right? In the terms of either on harassment, going after their employers, tarring their name with false and baseless accusations, etc. And those who agree with them, even though they're believing in, many of them believing in a conspiracy theory, face very little personal consequence. And so the incentive game, if you think of it as sort of a market calculation, although that is going to have some inaccuracies when it comes to human psychology, but if you try to look at this as sort of a simplification, then if you're going to face an incredibly heavy cost, say like 10,000 times the cost of disagreeing with someone, versus if you agree with them, even if they're saying something that's false and you have very little consequence in saying that thing that is false, then that cynical calculation is going to be made by many people. Mm-hmm. And so you get this phenomenon in which a small ideological minority is able to take over and wield larger and larger institutions and enforce a greater and greater hegemony. However, this is going to vary from institution to institution. The exact way that it manifests in politics, for example, is going to be different than how it manifests in a corporate boardroom, which is going to be different from how it manifests in campuses, right? So the core guiding principle, I think, when it comes to undoing this root problem is to look at the phenomenon. The phenomenon is an incentive game, and to undo it, you undo the incentive game. Now, this has two components, and people are going to disagree in how far you go in each of these two components. I think the less controversial one is protection, standing up for those who dissent, standing up for those who present evidence, particularly against obviously false accusations, creating like
cancellation insurance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Creating greater opportunities for them, creating situations and organizations that could help them, like FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, run by Greg Lukianoff now, for example, and really providing an active counterweight. People who disagree with this are mainly going to be on the sort of reactionary conservative side that are saying that you're just creating another institution that's waiting to be taken over. And that's somewhat of a concern. But if you apply the other principles, the other actions, in a way that would keep this institution from taking over, then there's a significant inroad to be made by that side. But the more controversial thing that many are suggesting now, many of those who are on the more right-wing side, and actually much fewer of those who are on the therapist side or on the free speech absolutist side, is that unfortunately you do have to go after many of these people as individuals in terms of changing the incentive structure involved. Now, I talked about the problem with dealing with them in individuals in the sort of therapeutic lens and the sort of dialogue sense, in that it doesn't actually change the broader calculation of decisions that are being made. However, many of the actual things that can be done to change those incentives are, unfortunately, things that we wouldn't normally want to do in ordinary situations. Socially ostracizing people for believing in these kind of quote-unquote woke conspiracy theories, calling for quite frankly, mutually assured cancellation, for example, going after people's employment if they are willing to go after others' employment, are going to be things that people disagree with, people disagreeing with it on principle. However, I think just in the way that you would be justified in shooting someone who is pointing a gun at you, you are more than justified in calling for a mutually assured cancellation. And so this rebalancing of the scales is the major common principle that can be used in terms of looking at each of these institutions.
So there's a counterweight that's a network of support, and probably embedded in that is a bunch of tools for argumentation and this liberal apparatus or toolkit. And then the other option is a counterpillory, where we create another town square with a nice little scaffold there and a bucket of rotten vegetables to pelt at the offenders of our values. Yeah.
And quite frankly, I'm honestly much more willing to go through this sort of incentive rebalancing than I think most people are, even those who are more politically involved or more directly involved in the kind of cultural fights. Because I think for many of them, there's a gut reaction to the don't be as bad as them appeal, right? But I think the thing that those people miss, or there are two things that those people miss. One of which is that shooting someone who's pointing a gun at you is not the same as shooting someone who is doing nothing, right? That there is no moral equivalence to be drawn. And it's kind of like the core Kantian flaw of would you tell a murderer where your friend is hiding, right? Context matters, and the context of going after someone who is going after you is a world apart from just going after someone in a vacuum. And so that would be the foundational moral appeal that I'm making to those wings who would disagree on those fronts. The second is that, sorry, go ahead.
You would have to, and this is one problem with motivating or incentivizing that, is that you would have to really prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that people are being hunted down, and they are, but that narrative is constantly being papered over. Cancel culture is always being kind of forgotten and eroded by our attention spans and a lot of other things. So you'd really have to cement the idea. Even the president of the United States got banned from a social media platform, and that was kind of not a big deal a week later. So you really have to cement that idea.
Yeah, the question of salience is certainly one that I want to answer later on, because that's actually, I think, the major political innovation of the last 2 decades. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about with regards to the original question is that there's a self-termination to the turn another cheek liberalism, right? That is the very thing that is being cannibalized now, right? That was the status quo. That was the approach that people had to these left-wing extremists even before all of this started springing up, right? So that was already the approach that people were trying to, quote unquote, treat it with. And the result is the world that we live in now. The result is not only ineffective, but self-destructive in terms of giving people who are willing to exploit your grace exactly the rope that they need to hang you with, right? So that would be the other appeal that I would really want to make. And the reason why I'm making these kind of explicit call-outs to what I assume are parts of your audience is because, especially on Clubhouse, and especially on various communications and crossovers with people who are fighting these fights, I think the most important thing that can be done is to unify these three groups, to unify the therapists, the free speech absolutists, and the reactionary conservatives in a way that takes a solid, calculated look at the institutions and understands what's to be done with it, as opposed to the scattershot of ideas, many of which are self-destructive, that end up losing the game, I think.
In a way, I always go back to my WoW days, but you need to have like a kind of a stacked front where you have the tanks in the front, the bulls in the China in front, and then the DPS, which would be the liberals with all their fancy rhetoric and sophistry and all these ideas, and then the healer in back that's taking in the wounded and mending everybody else up. But the thing is that the healers really don't like the methodology of the bulls at all, and they get really offended. And then the liberals like kind of tend to want to be the peacemakers, and so defer to they're always like the weakest link, always. Because they're seeing both sides, and then they try to facilitate, do I be polite? But we need to be rude, because it's focused outward. It's not focused towards us. It's focused at this institution. So there are a lot of psychological problems with getting those three to get along, because they end up doing a lot of fighting amongst themselves.
Yeah, who would have thought that it's harder to organize people with principles than people without principles?
It's got to be like an Art of War thing. Are you drawing upon your Art of War days?
I don't know, because the Art of War kind of... I mean, there's still a lot of value to it, but there's quite a bit of the Art of War that relies on having a rational opponent. And that's not necessarily what we're facing now. And that's a core divergence from those things, right? I think there are certain techniques that you end up using, especially in like micro conversations, that really put you at risk if you're dealing with a rational opponent. But many of these sort of extremists, either on the left or the right, whenever you're debating them, they're not going to go for the obvious logical call out because they're simply unable to. And so there are certain risks that you would take that Sun Tzu would never take.
One other argument that needs to be made in order to facilitate, some sort of charter for these three groups that we're talking about to kind of come together for a limited period of time in order to defeat this systemic problem would be to really thoroughly set in place structures to defend against corruption of both of those things. So we don't want the pillaring to go an inch further than it has to. We don't want like that counter cancel culture to be corrupted in itself and just become about vengeance. We also don't want this system of support and shielding to be corrupted again, either by over compassion or by nefarious principles, or just a bunch of grifters going in there and siphoning the resources out of there. So you really would need to have this kind of this code of conduct or some sort of charter against corruption of those two things, and like really make that appeal to the people to say, listen, we're doing this and we're not going to do it any further. We're doing this thing, and it's a clean, efficient way of ensuring our victory.
Yeah, like it's almost as if we need a top-down organized hierarchy.
Is this where you start, you take off your clothes and you're wearing some lobster negligee? Is that the point in the conversation we're at?
I don't get that reference.
I'm just referencing Jordan Peterson and hierarchies and lobsters.
Okay, wait, what does Peterson have to do with lobsters?
He made an argument at some point about hierarchy and how it's been with us since lobsters, or even lobsters have a hierarchy because of dopamine. And then his fanboys just ran with it and then just memeified the whole thing. So that's kind of where that's from.
Yeah, I really see the whole Peterson movement, though, as an understandable, I don't want to say reaction, but understandable outcome of much of what has been done in academic thought, which is that I think what's been done in academic thought around morality in the past 2 centuries is a sort of half hyper sociopathy, half hyper sensitivity, in which people became completely desensitized to some of the moral foundations, right? Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations, although not in the terms that he used, where you had a very real attack against appeals to tradition, appeals to authority. And of course, all of these moral appeals, whether they be loyalty, tradition, loyalty, purity, authority, or whether they be liberalism, kindness, and equality, all these appeals are heuristics. They're things that give you a lot of simplicity, a lot of usefulness, and that have a small amount of error wrapped into them, right? So they're trades in that form. And it's very easy, especially now in our culture, and this is something that's been built up in academic thought, of easily identifying where tradition fails, where those errors lie, and understanding implicitly that these things are often false, right? Or not often false, I shouldn't say that, but can be used in a false way.
Yeah.
But there's not that equal understanding on the other side, right? There's not that equal understanding of the fact that compassion, that empathy, is likewise a heuristic, is likewise a thing that is often useful, helps you identify a problem that's happening and identify in some terms, how to solve the problem, but can also go overboard, can also be hijacked, which is exactly what you've seen in, for example, the coddling of the American mind. Mm-hmm. Empathy becomes hijacked. People become incentivized to prevent their children from taking risks. This is because they care about their children, but this ends up with the children being underdeveloped and unable to function in the real world.
And it also leads to oppression Olympics because it incentivizes victimization, because then you get a bunch of cared points or caring points.
Yeah, and in politics, it actually just completely falls apart. But there's not this easy understanding of, you're making an appeal to tradition, and that's not necessarily true. That might be a bit flawed if you don't provide more evidence. We don't have that gut reaction when someone says, why don't you be more empathetic? And I know for many of the people who are listening to this, even people who agree with you or me, would say, oh, that's awfully cold-hearted for you to say. And quite frankly, it is. But it's equally as cold-hearted to say, like, oh, your appeal to tradition, that's a little bit, that's going to be flawed in some ways, right? We should have an equal response to those types of things, as we historically, I think, in human society have had, right? That's the evolutionary tendency for those heuristics to balance out. But when you have this, initially it was just a very sociopathic look at tradition, or you can say in a more generous term, an analytic look at tradition, but without the equal balancing of an analytic look at compassion or an analytic look at the appeals to equality, then those appeals end up taking over. Those appeals end up hijacking the discourse in a way that has no counterbalance. So in order to, I think, and this is a role that Peterson serves incredibly well, even though I don't agree with him on all of his points, you have to either insert back the role of tradition, insert back the role of those counterbalancing moral appeals, or you have to, quite frankly, behave analytically and looking at all aspects. And as long as that kind of equilibrium isn't achieved, I think there'll always be a role for people like Jordan.
Mm-hmm. Do you this is a veiled question about optimism, but do you think that human beings or society will be self-correcting? Do you think that, let's just say in the derogatory form, wokeness will burn itself out, the radical left will eat its own? Do you think that the correction is inevitable, and that the real question is to limit the damage of the overreach? Or do you think that it's all going to go down if it's not stopped? It's going to take everything.
There are a lot of corrections, and some of them look like a less organized version of China, and some of them look like a more organized version of Afghanistan. And I don't think either of those corrections are what we're going for. I think that we're going to at some point figure out the answer. There's going to be a lot of damage, or there has already been a lot of damage. Yeah. And I'm not sure that you will call or that you will have the same conception of America by the end of it. That is to say, I think it'll fix itself eventually. I don't think this leads to an extinction event in any terms. Okay. But there's a lot of things that people are not willing to recognize are being put on the table. Not just free speech, but freedom of association, of, quite frankly, not living in either China or Afghanistan, right? If you actually look at lives that people are living in those countries, then many things that you would assume as a default if you're an American are just not there. And I think that just looking at those two models gives you an understanding that there's a very far way to fall without losing, like, quote unquote civilization. Okay. But that falling that distance also is not a future that we want. Okay. And quite frankly, I don't know the exact kind of likelihoods, but I think it's more likely that we end up in worse China or better Afghanistan, slightly better Afghanistan, than we end up, for example, in a more optimistic branch, right? In a branch where there's a big political movement, we rally around it, we manage to restore common ground, restore truth and objectivity, and we end up relatively unscathed, as opposed to those two options, right? I think the option of, actually, I have no clue which one is more likely between worse Afghanistan or worse China or better Afghanistan. Could you describe
either of those dystopias briefly?
Yeah, well, worse China is like an authoritarian state that essentially monitors all of its citizens, that has strong enforcement of various opinions, but isn't completely like dictatorial-esque. Has a lot of top-down control, has very targeted technocratic rule from the top, and where people's liberties are restricted, those are mostly kind of hidden behind a curtain instead of like actively having a gun pointed at you, for example. Or slightly better Afghanistan is like a country that eventually goes to war with itself, that is extremely destabilized by outside forces, that has constant struggles over power. And I think the slightly better version of that would be that, but people are a bit wealthier.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
So if you had like God power and you could craft a republic or craft from this point forward, you somehow had a magic machine that created the restitution of our republic, what would that look like? Ideally, what would you work for if you had any optimistic bone in your body?
Well, there are a lot of core principles that I would jump to at first, and many of them can be gamified, but I would certainly have a much broader definition of free speech, including on certain platforms. Quite frankly, I think that certain platforms should probably, at the very least, have a national or public alternative, which is actually like a really left-wing idea, but I think I think the right-wingers can be sold on it given the current situation. Yeah, a lot more
socialized social media.
A lot more public infrastructure in terms of communications, I think, as well as in terms of things like banking, in terms of things like everything that's being manipulated now. That's kind of the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
That's just the sort of governance or media or not the media aspect of it, actually, but the governing or infrastructure aspect of it. I think I would have a pretty similar democratic system with a bit of sortition involved, which is essentially instead of a lot of the administrative positions, the sort of appointees that you would have, essentially being being directly connected to the presidency, I think I would have a randomly selected group of people who pass a certain bar, for example, can pass a basic competency test. And then you pick a random group of people from that pool, and maybe the president chooses from those, or whatever executive position chooses from those, just as a function of making corruption much more difficult. Actually, this came up in a conversation between, I think, Cal Newport and Lex Fridman, where he talked about most computer science problems being in this class of most lower bounds, most upper bounds. Most upper bounds of computer science problems tend to be very fragile. So what that means is that the kind of worst case scenario for how long will it take to solve this problem are usually very easily interfered with by just changing like a small amount of the data, right? And so I have this philosophy in government that is quite similar, of adding random noise functions to mess with people who want corruption, of adding just ways to insert tiny amounts of randomness that reduce the overall performance of a given role, of a given kind of bureaucracy or a given government function by a very small amount, but can make it much more difficult to corrupt.
Yeah,
and I think I would have like something that looks mostly like America, but with very inconspicuous noise functions put into various places.
I think that's a really smart idea, and it reminds me of one of those Greek city-states had a kind of a circular rotation of everybody who was a landowner, everybody who was a voter, qualified to be a citizen, so-called, would come up to some sort of officiating capacity several times in their life. There was just this lottery going on where they shared responsibility. If we could do that even on the local level, conscript experts to solve problems in a way, maybe even like package that in with student loan forgiveness, where we'll clear your we'll pay for your degree, but you have to serve. Yeah,
you're being paid in credit, or being paid in money, or for debt forgiveness for doing public service, which I think you should be paid for, right? So yeah, that's certainly something that is very interesting.
So your podcast, could you plug it and give the audience an overview of what you're tackling and how you're saving the world, one microphone-laden broadcast at a time?
Yeah, so the podcast is Metapolitics, META space politics, and I've gone through a series of seasons. The first season was really on corruption and electoral systems, how those dynamics play out. The second was in media, the kind of economic incentives at play, and some of the psychological biases that happen. And now the most recent season is about narrative warfare, about the way that political incentives end up leading people to manipulate media further and further. And I think the core appeal to it is that many people, including elected representatives, come up to me and they say, like, this phenomenon makes no sense. This thing that's happening, it's absolutely crazy. And I'm like, yes, it is. But people tend to do crazy things, and here's why. And that's sort of the elevator pitch for the show. That I think there's a lot to be understood, and that the information is out there, right? This isn't like groundbreaking research. This is pretty basic psychology, pretty basic economics that explains very advanced political phenomena and how to get out of it. And I think anyone who wants that rationality in their life, I guess, wants that way out, would enjoy the podcast.
And aside yourself, who are the thought leaders that you jive with the most and that you wish more people would be paying attention to?
Yeah, usually, I don't know. I feel like the instinct to this would be to shout out someone who's lesser known, but I'm actually just unfortunately, not that involved in the politics community. I like to put out my ideas, but I'm not too social in those environments. So most people have probably already heard of these, but Tristan Harris, Center for Humane Technology, social dilemma guy, really great at breaking down the influence of technology in various aspects. Jonathan Haidt is the kind of go-to psychology guy, moral foundations, the righteous mind, coddling of the American mind with Greg Lukianoff. He's an excellent leader in terms of thinking about this in terms of the psychological attributes that people have, in terms of the way that they develop their kind of ultimate worldview and their ultimate political opinions. And yeah, I'm just really trying to come up with someone obscure.
Yeah.
But quite frankly,
Noam Chomsky.
I don't know. Chomsky has a piece of the puzzle, but I don't know. I think Tristan Harris has certainly one of the best insights, and he has a podcast that people don't really pay that much attention to, and he doesn't really promote it himself, but it's quite good. It's called Your Undivided Attention. And of course, Benjamin Boyce, excellent, excellent.
You don't have to plug me on my own channel.
Too bad, you're being plugged on your own channel. Excellent commentator, documentarian, understands the soul of the current cultural moments, and really does a great job in putting together, I think, a full mosaic of what everyone is working on.
I have my fingers on the prostate of the cultural zeitgeist. Do you think you'll be turning your work into a book, or like a coffee table book, or a series of articles? Do you think you'll jump media in that way?
Yeah, I'm actually in the process of writing a book. I don't know if I'll ever get it published because it's probably controversial-ish. But I mean, even more controversial than what we're working on now, because I think the things that I kind of want to actually, the scenario that I think is the most likely to shoot for, and this is something that I don't really talk about often, and this is like very controversial, is probably in a world where you're probably going to end up in a world, and this is like the optimistic one, even though it still sounds like a dystopia, you're probably going to end up in a world where the people who are willing to seek out independent information are going to have to be the ones to contribute to a kind of decentralized narrative warfare, where you're going to have everyone doing narrative warfare, and you're going to have a lot of stupid people doing narrative warfare for certain political interests. And it's going to be up to the smart people who and I use smart people like very broadly, right? Like anyone who like sees past the very simplistic narrative. So like, I think there are quite many smart people in the world, but people who see past the simplistic narrative, the narrative warfare that's currently being used, to understand that they themselves have to use many of these tools to reorganize some of what happens, to, quite frankly, be emotionally manipulative in similar ways, but in terms of in favor of issues or in favor of positions that are actually backed by objectivity, that are actually backed by like actual science, not like the fucking science TM. But I think
fight sophistry with sophistry then.
Yeah, I think that the thing I'm going to write is going to be heavily focused on those dynamics, on the actual narrative warfare itself. It's going to touch on many of the topics on the podcast. I'm just still road mapping it now, but yeah, I'm certainly interested on creating a simple package, or I don't want to say simple either, but a packaged version of the book that isn't actually like 5 hours of audio spread across dozens of episodes.
What are some of the central tools or values of being aware of the narrative warfare that's happening and combating it? I guess aside from just unplugging your phone and not watching any news, what can the average person do to be a more positive contributor to the betterment of the information economy.
Yeah, I mean, one is the thing that we talked about earlier, which is to recognize the incentive game, to recognize the things that are probably running through, at the very least, the board members, if not the individual journalists of every single news institution, and just to recognize the game that's being played, right? This is actually like a very basic sort of broader media literacy thing, is to understand what people are trying to get you to believe, to understand their motive. In terms of actually contributing and making things a better place, there are certain statistical or scientific methods that you can use to try to make sure that you're collecting good information. Things ranging from very basic things like the scientific method to various statistical analyses that you can do if you're so inclined, of actually making sure that your information is accurate and your information is representative of some broader trend. And really just, quite honestly, just sharing ideas, because it doesn't take a lot to be better than many of the existing kind of legacy media. Yeah. And in fact, I think that, like, would I trust the average person? I don't know, because there's so much baked into that phrase, right? Like the average person. Like the average person probably watches CNN, so I'm probably not sure if that makes them more trustworthy than CNN. But would I trust the average independent creator more than like some of these objectively, or not objectively, but like with a very high degree of likelihood, you can say that most of these institutions are actively politically motivated, and that anyone who even shows like their process, shows their methods of getting to a given conclusion, especially if those conclusions are, as I talked about before, scientifically sound, are probably more trustworthy than the state of American media, I think. So that's the unfortunate reality, is that at the very least, at the current state, just like doing something is very good for the environment.
Just exercise, just 15 minutes of free thought a day. Yeah,
actually, this is something that I think and that Eric Weinstein has said, which is that you can just try to compile the source code, right? Try to compile the arguments that you get together, and if they create something that's coherent, then you can just like put that as a data point that these set of ideas, this ideology, or this political policy, this compiles. This can successfully put itself together, and that just doing that itself is already cuts like 90% of the political field, right? So putting those data points out for your friends, for your own social network, is probably something that is an incredibly productive use of your time.
Do you have any weird hobbies?
Yeah, I play Super Smash Bros. Melee for the Nintendo GameCube.
By yourself or against yourself? Or do you have like a club?
You can play it online with an emulator. With a very legally obtained ROM.
Very legal, because Nintendo's so open source.
It's not called a ROM for a GameCube. It's called a ISO or whatever. But it's a very interesting, albeit old game. It's from like 2001. But very enjoyable.
Where did you how do I introduce you? Like what's your basic function in the world? Are you a social scientist, economist, chef? Congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.